The heavy mahogany doors of the library swung open at 2:47 a.m., and Brielle looked up from the silver she was polishing to see a shadow that would change her life forever. Lee Tae-sung strode into the room with the kind of presence that made the very air in the estate grow heavy. He was tall, his silhouette sharp against the dim hallway lights, moving with a calculated precision that suggested he owned not just the house, but the breath in Brielle's lungs. Behind him, a younger lieutenant followed like a silent shadow, but it was Tae-sung who commanded the space. Tae-sung was not a man people forgot. At 36, he possessed a face that was a masterpiece of cold discipline, a sharp jawline, dark hair styled with ruthless care, and eyes that missed nothing. He wore a white button-down shirt, crisp and expensive, though the humidity of the stormy night had made it cling to his frame. As he reached to loosen his silk tie, the movement revealed a glimpse of the delicate vertical Korean tattoo running along the side of his neck, a mark of refined violence that warned the city of who he truly was. The storm outside the estate wasn't merely weather. It was a reflection of the man who owned the land. Inside the master suite, the air was pressurized, heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the ozone of the coming lightning. Lee Tae-sung stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, his movements slow and deliberate, a study in lethal grace. He was a man built on the foundation of absolute order. Every morning, the ritual was the same. The silk tie knotted with mathematical precision, the cufflinks snapped into place like the chambering of a round, and the charcoal gray suit jacket that fit him like armor. To the public, the tailoring was a sign of wealth. To the underworld, it was the casing of a weapon. He tilted his head slightly to the left, catching his reflection. There, tracing the line of his jaw and descending into his collar, was the vertical script of his neck tattoo. The ink was old, a deep obsidian that seemed to pulse when he moved. It was a warning, a quiet, permanent declaration of his history. In the syndicate, men often wore their sins on their backs in sprawling, colorful murals, but Tae-sung's mark was different. It was visible even in a suit, a deliberate crack in his refined facade that told the power elite of the city exactly who they were dealing with. He was the monster who had learned how to wear a tie. As he stepped out into the long, wainscoted hallway, the silence of the house didn't just break, it bowed. Two men, their frames nearly doubling the width of the corridor, snapped to attention. These were not mere bodyguards. They were extensions of his will, trained to interpret the slightest flick of his wrist as a command for life or death. Their presence was a constant reminder of the weight Tae-sung carried. He moved past them without a word, the soft click of his leather shoes on the hardwood the only sound in the cavernous space. He found himself pausing at the top of the grand staircase, his eyes scanning the lower floor. His mind, usually occupied with shipping manifests and territorial disputes, kept drifting back to the library. He could still see the way the light had caught the small pearl in Brielle's ear, the way her breath had hitched when the doors opened. It was a glitch in his perfect system. Tae-sung was a master of casual menace, a man who could terrify an entire boardroom with a single, calm stare. He was used to people trembling because of his reputation, but the way Brielle had flinched was different. It wasn't the fear of a boss, it was the cellular memory of a victim. He watched from the shadows as she moved through the foyer below, a tray of tea service in her hands. She was so quiet, so intentional in her attempts to be invisible, that she almost succeeded. In the grand hierarchy of his world, she should have been a non-entity, part of the background, like the antique vases or the heavy velvet drapes. Yet, he found his gaze tracking her with a predatory focus that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with a sudden, sharp curiosity. He descended the stairs, his presence causing a ripple of tension among the staff. The head housekeeper dipped her head so low she nearly stumbled, but Tae-sung didn't look at her. His eyes were on the girl in the dark uniform. As he reached the bottom step, a thunderclap shook the window panes, the white flash of lightning illuminating the hallway. For a split second, the shadows vanished, and he saw the way Brielle's hands shook against the silver tray. He stepped into her path, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. He wanted to say something, to exercise the authority that usually came so easily, but the words felt heavy in his throat. He realized then that his power, the guards, the suits, the tattoo, the blood-stained history of his name, was useless here. He could order a man killed with a whisper, but he couldn't command a woman to stop being afraid of a memory. "The silver," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in the small space between them. "It's clean enough." Brielle didn't look up, her gaze fixed on his polished shoes. "Yes, Mr. Lee. I'm sorry, sir." He lingered for a moment too long, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. He could feel the eyes of his guards on his back, their confusion radiating through the air. They were waiting for the monster to bark a command, for the boss to demand perfection. Instead, Taesung simply adjusted his cuff, the silk sliding over his wrist, and walked past her toward the waiting black sedan outside. But as the car pulled away into the rain, the anatomy of his menace felt changed. The armor was still there, the tattoos still warned of danger, but for the first time in 36 years, Lee Taesung felt the terrifying itch of a conscience he had thought he'd traded for a throne. Brielle moved through the master wing of the estate like a ghost haunting its own life. She had learned early on that survival in Lee Taesung's world depended on the absence of sound. The thick, plush carpets were her allies, muffling the tread of her sensible flats as she carried fresh linens toward the master bedroom. In this house, walls didn't just have ears, they had memories of every hushed conversation and every cold command issued from the shadows. To be the invisible maid was more than a job description, it was a sanctuary. She pushed open the heavy oak doors to the master suite, her heart performing its customary, frantic skip. Even when the room was empty, the air felt occupied. It carried the lingering charge of Taesung's presence, a scent of cold rain and expensive tobacco that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains. Brielle began her work with practiced, mechanical efficiency. She smoothed the heavy silk sheets with palms that had grown calloused long before she arrived at this mansion, her eyes never lingering too long on the personal effects scattered across the dresser. A gold watch, a heavy signet ring, a leather-bound ledger, items belonging to a man who moved the pieces of the city like a grandmaster on a chessboard. As she tucked the corners of the duvet, she caught her reflection in the gilded mirror. The dark uniform and white ruffled apron felt like a costume, a shell that hid the woman who had fled across state lines with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fear that wouldn't stop screaming. She touched the small pearl earrings, the only thing she had left from her mother, and felt a wave of nausea. She was safe here, she told herself. Monsters like Lee Taesung didn't notice the dust beneath their feet. As long as she stayed in the periphery, as long as she remained a shadow in the corner of his peripheral vision, the past couldn't find her. But the estate was a cage of a different sort. She lived in the servants' quarters, a stark contrast to the opulence of the main house, where the silence was often broken by the distant, rhythmic thud of the heavy front doors or the low murmur of men with guns under their jackets. She spent her days navigating the anatomy of menace she saw in every corner of the house. She knew which floorboards creaked, which guards were prone to cruelty, and which hallways to avoid when the monster was in a foul mood. The master bedroom was the heart of the labyrinth. She spent nearly an hour there, ensuring the temperature was precisely 68 degrees and the lighting was dimmed to the exact amber hue Taesung preferred. She found herself staring at the empty space where he stood every morning. She thought about the vertical tattoo on his neck, the way it seemed to pulse against his skin. Most people looked at him and saw a king. Brielle looked at him and saw a predator who had simply mastered the art of the suit. He was terrifying, yes, but he was also the only wall standing between her and the world outside. She was reaching to adjust the heavy drapes when the door clicked. Her blood turned to ice. It was too early for him to be back. She retreated into the shadows of the dressing room, her back pressed against the cold wood of the wardrobe, her breath coming in shallow, jagged sips. From her vantage point, she saw the door swing open. It wasn't Taesung. It was one of his lieutenants, a man with a jagged scar across his brow and eyes that held a restless, hungry light. He didn't belong in the master suite. He prowled the room with a disrespect that made Brielle's skin crawl, his hands hovering over the items on the dresser. She stayed frozen, a statue in a dark alcove. This was the rule. Do not be seen. Do not exist. If she stayed still enough, the world would forget she was there. But as the man turned toward the dressing room, his gaze sweeping the shadows, the familiar, cold claw of trauma tightened around her throat. Her knees shook, a treacherous vibration that threatened to betray her. She thought of the library, the way Taesung had looked at her when she flinched, the way his dark eyes hadn't held cruelty, but a strange, unsettling focus. The lieutenant took a step closer to her hiding spot, his nostrils flaring as if he could scent her fear. Brielle squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the invisibility she had cultivated so carefully to hold. She was a ghost, she told herself. She was nothing. She was just the help. The heavy silence was suddenly shattered by the sound of footsteps in the hall. Heavy, rhythmic, and unmistakable. The lieutenant froze, his posture snapping from predatory to subservient in a heartbeat. Brielle exhaled, a silent, shaky breath, as the monster returned to his lair. She realized then, with a terrifying clarity, that she wasn't just hiding from the world in this house. She was trapped between the man who had broken her and the man who could destroy everything else. The storm had settled into a persistent, rhythmic drumming against the library's leaded glass, a sound that usually centered Taesung. Tonight, however, it felt like an intrusion. He sat behind his desk, the light of a single desk lamp casting the ink-black script on his neck into sharp relief. Across from him stood Brielle. She was motionless, her hands clasped tightly in front of her white apron, her gaze fixed on a point exactly 3 inches above the Persian rug. In the boardroom or the backrooms of the city's docks, Taesung's silence was a weapon. He used it to suffocate his enemies until they spilled their secrets just to fill the void. But as the seconds stretched into a minute, he realized that the silence was failing him. It wasn't building tension, it was building a wall. The man who was in my suite this afternoon, Taesung began, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that made his lieutenants sweat. Kim, he told me you were cleaning the dressing room. He also told me you looked as though you had seen a ghost. Brielle's shoulders tightened, a microscopic movement that didn't escape his predatory focus. I was merely startled, Mr. Lee. I didn't expect anyone to enter while I was working. Taesung leaned forward, the movement slow and serpentine. He was a man who commanded the weight of immediate obedience. He was used to the truth being handed to him on a silver platter, often accompanied by a plea for mercy. He wanted to demand the truth now. He wanted to use the authority that had built his empire to strip away her defenses and see what lived in the shadows of her eyes. You didn't just look startled, Brielle, he said, his tone sharpening. You looked hunted. I don't allow people in my house to feel hunted unless I am the one doing the hunting. He expected her to break. Most people did. He expected her to stammer an apology or confess a mistake. Instead, she lifted her chin. It was a small act of defiance, a quiet hardening of her posture that surprised him. Her eyes met his, not with the standard fear of a victim, but with the weary, guarded stare of a veteran of a war he didn't understand. With all respect, sir, she said, her voice barely a whisper but steady. Some things cannot be commanded out of a person. You can tell me when to wake, what to clean, and where to stand. But you cannot order me to trust you. The air in the library seemed to vanish. Taesung felt a sudden, sharp surge of frustration. He was a man of logic and leverage. He understood power, and he understood fear. But trust was a currency he had never traded in. He realized, with a cold sinking in his chest, that his entire arsenal, his wealth, his guards, the very violence that had made him a king, was useless against the woman standing 5 feet away. He could force her to speak, but he couldn't force her to be honest. He could protect her body, but he was currently the biggest threat to her peace of mind. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long, jagged shadow across the books. He walked around the desk, stopping just outside her personal space. He could smell the faint scent of lemon wax and something softer, like vanilla, clinging to her. He saw the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat, a frantic little bird trapped beneath her skin. I am the head of the Lee Syndicate, he said, and for the first time, the title felt like a hollow mask. My word is law in this city. If someone is bothering you, if someone from your past is the reason you flinch when a door opens, I can erase them. Do you understand? I can make it as if they never existed. I know what you are, Mr. Lee, Brielle replied, and the sadness in her voice cut deeper than any blade. That's why I can't tell you. You solve problems with fire. Some things, they just need to be left in the dark. She bowed then, a quick, jerky motion, and turned to leave. Taesung didn't stop her. He watched her go, the heavy library doors clicking shut behind her. He remained standing in the center of the room, the monster in the master suite, feeling a strange, clawing sensation in his chest. He was a man who had everything, yet he had just been told that the one thing he truly wanted to fix was the one thing his power couldn't touch. He looked at his hands, hands that had built an empire and broken men, and saw them for what they were, tools of destruction. To help her, he would have to learn a language he didn't speak. He would have to learn how to be a guardian without being a threat. And as the lightning flashed outside, illuminating the vertical ink on his neck, Lee Taesung realized that the hardest battle of his life wouldn't be fought on the streets, but within the silent halls of his own home. The breaking point didn't happen in the dead of night or behind the heavy oak doors of the study. It happened in the mundane clarity of a Tuesday afternoon. The estate was unusually busy, the air thick with the arrival of several high-ranking associates for an emergency summit. Taesung stood at the top of the marble staircase, his hands resting on the cold stone balustrade, watching the controlled chaos below. He was the eye of the storm, his presence alone keeping the restless energy of his soldiers in check. Brielle was there, a quiet blur of dark fabric and white lace, moving through the foyer with a tray of refreshments. She was performing her role to perfection, weaving through the clusters of broad-shouldered men like a draft of wind. Taesung's eyes followed her, his mind still working through the frustration of their last encounter. He was looking for the resilience he had seen in the library, the quiet strength that had dared to tell him he couldn't command her trust. Then, the heavy front doors groaned open. A man entered, not one of Taesung's regulars, but a middleman for the city's shipping unions. She didn't hear him. She was trapped in a memory, her breath coming in tiny, panicked hitches that barely inflated her lungs. She looked smaller than he had ever realized, a delicate, broken thing living in a house of monsters. The sight of her, reduced to this raw state of vulnerability, did something to Taesung that no rival's threat ever could. It made him feel a jagged, burning sort of shame. The guest stepped forward, still oblivious to the edge he was standing on. "Hey, I'll pay for the cups, Lee. The girl's just a bit jumpy." Taesung turned. It was a slow, predatory pivot. He didn't raise his hand, and he didn't raise his voice, but the look in his eyes made the man's words die in his throat. Taesung's shadow fell over the visitor, the vertical tattoo on his neck appearing like a dark blade in the afternoon light. "Get out," Taesung whispered. "What?" "We have the meeting." "Out," Taesung repeated, the word carrying the weight of a death sentence. "And if you ever raise your voice in this house again, I will ensure it is the last sound you ever make." The room cleared in seconds. The soldiers ushered the guest away with frantic haste, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them. Only the two of them remained in the foyer, the monster and the ghost. Language he spoke fluently. He was currently preparing to hunt a man down to save her, but in doing so, he would only be confirming her greatest fear, that the world was nothing but a succession of powerful men deciding her fate with violence. The terror in his chest tightened. If he killed Thorn, he was the monster who protected her. If he didn't, he was the man who allowed her to be destroyed. It was a paradox that his tactical mind couldn't solve. He found himself pacing the small room, the rhythmic click of his shoes sounding like a countdown. He thought of the way Brielle moved through his house, the invisible maid, who wanted only to be left alone in the shadows. By inserting himself into her past, he was dragging her back into the light of a war she never asked for. He wondered if he was capable of being anything else. Could the head of a crime syndicate ever offer peace? Or was his very existence a threat to her healing? He reached out to touch the monitor, his thumb tracing the jagged scar on Thorn's face, and then he looked at his own hand. He saw the power there, the ability to crush, to command, to erase. It was a weapon he had spent a lifetime sharpening, and now, it was the only thing standing between Brielle and a ghost. Yet, he feared that by using it, he would permanently seal the door between them. He would be her savior, yes, but he would also be her ultimate jailer, the one man she could never truly escape because she would always owe him her life. This was the unnamed fear, that made his pulse erratic. It wasn't Thorn he was afraid of. It was the possibility that he and Thorn were two sides of the same coin. He stood in the blue light, the hunter's instinct warring with a newfound, aching vulnerability. He wanted to go to her, to tell her she was safe, but he knew the moment he stepped into her room, his shadow would swallow her whole. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool glass of the screen. He had to be the monster one last time. He had to use the fire she feared to burn away the shadow that hunted her. But the price of that retribution would be the one thing he had begun to crave more than power. The chance to be seen by her as a man, and not as a nightmare in a three-piece suit. He took a long, steadying breath, the air whistling through his teeth, and pushed off the wall. The terror was still there, clawing at his ribs, but he pushed it down, burying it beneath the cold discipline of the syndicate boss. He had a ghost to kill, even if it meant becoming one himself. The storm finally broke, but not with rain. It began with the screech of tires on the gravel drive and the sudden, violent shattering of the grand foyer's stained glass. Taesung was in the gallery when the perimeter alarms wailed, a low, guttural pulse that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't flinch. He simply reached into his waistband, his fingers finding the cold grip of the matte black handgun, and moved toward the stairs. Below, the estate's sanctuary had been violated. Marcus Thorne hadn't come with the subtlety of a ghost. He had come with the desperate, loud brutality of a man who thought he had nothing to lose. He had brought a small, ragged crew of mercenaries, men who lacked the discipline of the Lee Syndicate but possessed the frantic energy of cornered rats. "Where is she?" Thorne's voice echoed through the marble hall, raw and jagged. "Bring her out, Lee. She belongs to me." Taesung reached the landing, the vertical tattoo on his neck stark against the white of his collar. He looked down at the scene with a terrifying, detached calm. His own guards had already materialized from the shadows, their weapons raised with military precision. The territory war was instantaneous. Muzzle flashes strobed against the vintage wallpaper, lighting up the narrow hallway like a nightmare. Inside the sanctum of the estate, the air filled with the smell of cordite and pulverized plaster. Taesung moved through the chaos with the grace of a ghost. He wasn't just defending his home, he was purging an infection. He saw one of Thorne's men lunging toward the servant's wing and silenced him with a single, clinical shot before the man could even scream. But his mind wasn't on the tactical victory. It was on the third floor. Brielle was trapped in the very place she had sought as a refuge. Taesung could feel the weight of her terror from across the house. For her, the sounds of the gunshots weren't a battle for territory. They were the echoes of her past catching up, the literal sound of her nightmares breaking through the door. "Thorne!" Taesung's voice roared over the cacophony, a sound of such pure, predatory authority that the room momentarily went still. He descended the final steps, stepping over the debris of his own opulence. Marcus Thorne stood near the shattered entrance, his face flushed and sweating, a jagged scar white against his skin. He looked at Taesung, at the expensive suit, the sharp jawline, and the absolute lack of fear, and for the first time, the bully realized he had walked into the mouth of a god. "You don't know what you're protecting," Thorne spat, his hand shaking as he leveled his weapon. "She's a runner. She's mine. She is a guest in my house," Taesung replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that was far more terrifying than the gunfire. "And in this house, I am the only one who decides who belongs to whom. You have brought filth into my home. You have made her flinch for the last time." The siege intensified as Thorne's remaining men realized they were outclassed. They began to fire wildly, hitting the priceless vases and tearing through the velvet drapes. It was a desecration of everything Taesung held dear, his order, his control, his silence. But as a bullet grazed the wainscoting inches from his head, Taesung didn't feel anger. He felt a cold, sharp clarity. He saw Brielle then. She had appeared at the top of the servant's staircase, her face a mask of pure, paralyzed horror. Her eyes locked onto Thorne, and then they shifted to Taesung. In that moment, the territory being fought over wasn't the estate, it was her soul. She was watching two monsters tear each other apart, and the unnamed fear from the night before returned to claw at Taesung's chest. He saw the way she looked at the gun in his hand. To her, he was currently indistinguishable from the man who had broken her. "Brielle, get back!" he shouted, but Thorn had already seen her. Thorn lunged for the stairs, a desperate, final gambit to reclaim his property. Taesung didn't hesitate. He bypassed the cover of the pillars, stepping into the open line of fire. He didn't care about the lead flying through the air or the blood staining his white shirt. He fired 3 times in rapid succession, the rounds hitting with a heavy, wet thud. Thorn collapsed at the base of the stairs, his life leaking out onto the Persian rug. The silence that followed was deafening. The remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader fallen, dropped their weapons or fled into the rainy night. Taesung stood over the body, his chest heaving, the monster fully unleashed. He looked up at Brielle. She was still standing on the landing, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a shock that transcended words. The siege was over. The threat was erased. But as Taesung looked at the blood on his hands and the terror still etched in Brielle's face, he knew the real war had only just begun. He had won the house, but he was further than ever from winning the woman. The aftermath of the siege left the foyer smelling of iron and spent gunpowder. Taesung stood amidst the wreckage, his white shirt stained with a spray of crimson that looked like a macabre ink blot against the fine cotton. His lieutenants were already moving through the shadows, their voices low and efficient as they began the grim work of sanitizing the scene. "Boss," his second-in-command whispered, stepping over Thorn's cooling body. "We can handle this quietly. A few calls to the precinct, a clean transfer of the bodies to the docks, and by sunrise, this never happened. We tell the city it was a botched robbery by low-level drifters. No one needs to know Thorn was here for her. Your reputation stays intact." It was the logical choice. The clean business solution would preserve the myth of Lee Taesung as a ghost, a man too powerful to be touched by personal vendettas, too disciplined to let a maid's past disrupt the syndicate's equilibrium. To admit that he had turned his home into a slaughterhouse over a woman was to show a crack in the armor that his enemies would exploit for years. Taesung didn't answer. He was looking up the stairs. Brielle hadn't moved. She was a pale statue against the dark wood of the banister, her eyes fixed on the man who had haunted her life, now reduced to a motionless heap on a rug. The terror hadn't left her. It had simply crystallized into a hollow, haunting silence. She looked at Taesung, and he saw the question in her eyes. She was waiting for the next cage. She was waiting to see if her savior would demand a different kind of price for the blood he had spilled. The unnamed fear in Taesung's chest flared into a brilliant, agonizing heat. He looked at his men, the professional cleaners, the silent soldiers, the architects of a world where everything could be buried. If he chose the quiet path, Brielle would remain a secret. She would go back to being a shadow in his halls, forever indebted to a monster, living in a peace that was bought with lies. She would always wonder if the next man through the door was coming to finish what Thorn started. Then he looked back at her. He saw the small pearl earrings, the trembling hands, and the frail woman who had survived a hell he could barely imagine. He realized that a quiet solution was just another form of invisibility. To truly protect her, he couldn't just erase the man. He had to erase the fear. He had to send a message so loud, so violent, and so public that no one in the city, from the highest penthouse to the lowest gutter, would ever dare to look at her with anything but reverence. "No," Taesung said, his voice a low vibration that stopped the cleaners in their tracks. "Sir?" the lieutenant asked, confused. "We don't bury this," Taesung said, turning to face his men. The casual menace was gone, replaced by a resolve that felt like a shifting of tectonic plates. "Leave the bodies where the police will find them. Call the press. Tell them Marcus Thorn was executed for trespassing on my soul." The room went deathly still. This was a declaration of war against his own anonymity. It was a messy, public act of protection that would stun the city's power elite. He was choosing to expose his vulnerability to the world, to let his enemies see the one thing that could make him irrational, a maid from Georgia with a terrified Flinch. He began to walk up the stairs, his leather shoes clicking on the marble. With every step, he felt the weight of the crown he was intentionally shattering. By dawn, the city would know that Lee Taesung was no longer a machine of cold logic. They would know he was a man who burned his own sanctuary to keep a woman warm. He stopped 2 steps below Brielle, putting himself at her eye level so he didn't tower over her. He didn't reach out. He didn't want to see her recoil from the blood on his cuffs. "It's over, Brielle," he said. The words were soft, stripped of the authority he usually wore like a weapon. "There are no more ghosts. Not in this house. Not in this city." Brielle looked at him, really looked at him, beyond the suit and the tattoo. She saw the choice he had just made. She saw the monster offering up his own throat to ensure her safety. A single tear tracked through the dust and grime on her cheek, and for the first time since he had met her, she didn't look away. "You're going to lose everything," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the cavernous foyer. Taesung allowed himself a small, grim smile. He looked at the chaos below and then back at the woman in front of him. "I've spent 36 years owning everything," he said. "It turns out I was just keeping the seat warm for something that actually mattered." By the time the sun began to bleed over the Chicago skyline, the silence of the Lee estate had been replaced by the rhythmic strobe of emergency lights and the low hum of a city in shock. Usually, a man like Taesung would have vanished into the mist long before the first sirens arrived, leaving behind a sterilized scene and a wall of no comments. But today he stood on his front lawn, the morning frost biting at his skin, and did something that defied every law of his survival. He stayed. The casual menace that had governed his reputation for over a decade was gone, replaced by a monumental, public display of power. He had invited the world to look. News crews stood behind the police perimeter, their lenses trained on the man who had long been a phantom of the underworld. Taesung stood at the center of the driveway, his blood-stained white shirt stark against the gray morning, his hand resting firmly on the door of his armored sedan. Inside the car sat Brielle. He had wrapped her in his own suit jacket, a heavy, charcoal gray wool that smelled of him and safety. To the cameras, she was a mystery, a hidden figure behind the tinted glass. But to the power elite watching from their penthouses, she was a message. Taesung wasn't just protecting a maid. He was declaring a new border. By refusing to hide the carnage, by letting Thorne's body be carried out in front of the morning news, he was telling every rival and every predator that the rules of engagement had changed. He had traded his anonymity for her peace. The head of the city's organized crime task force, a man who had spent years trying to put Taesung in a room just like this, approached him with a mix of wariness and disbelief. "You're making a mistake, Lee," the detective whispered, his breath hitching in the cold air. "You're putting a target on your back. You're telling everyone you have a weakness." Taesung adjusted his cuff, the movement as elegant and disciplined as ever, despite the chaos. He looked at the detective, the vertical tattoo on his neck prominent in the morning light. "It's only a weakness if they think I'll hesitate," Taesung replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried to the nearest microphones. "Let them know that I didn't kill Marcus Thorne because he was a rival. I killed him because he made a woman under my roof afraid. If anyone else wishes to test the depth of my retribution, they are welcome to try." It was an act of public madness, a confession and a coronation all at once. The monster had claimed a ward. As the car began to move, Taesung stepped into the passenger seat beside Brielle. The interior of the sedan was a silent, leather-scented sanctuary. The roar of the reporters and the shouting of the police faded as the heavy doors sealed. He looked at Brielle, who was clutching the lapels of his jacket, her eyes no longer wide with the paralyzing terror of the Flinch, but filled with a quiet, shimmering awe. She reached out, her fingers trembling only slightly as she touched the sleeve of his shirt, near the stain of Thorne's blood. "They'll never stop looking at you now," she whispered. "You gave up your shadow for me." Taesung reached out, and for the first time, he didn't stop himself from touching her. He placed his hand over hers, a hand that had built an empire through violence, now resting gently over her heart. "I've lived in the shadows long enough, Brielle," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I'd rather be seen as a man who protects what is his than a ghost who owns nothing." The city was indeed shocked. By noon, the stock market for his front companies dipped, and his rivals were already meeting in dark rooms to discuss the cracks in his facade. But as the car glided through the city streets, toward a destination only Taesung knew, the atmosphere between them had finally settled. The power dynamic had shifted. He was still the boss, and she was still the woman who had survived, but the fear that had acted as a wall between them had been burned away in the fire of the previous night. He watched the city pass by through the window, the vertical ink on his neck a permanent reminder of the man he was, and the woman beside him a reminder of the man he was becoming. The casual menace was dead. In its place was something far more dangerous to his enemies, a monster with something to love. "Where are we going?" Brielle asked, her voice finally finding its strength. Taesung didn't look back at the estate. He didn't look back at the ruins of his perfect, controlled life. He simply looked at her and squeezed her hand. "Wherever you can breathe," he said.